The night the truth fractured my world, I couldn't even remember what program flickered across the silent television, only that the glow reflected faintly off the walls and the glass coffee table while her words hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear, drifting through every corner of the room until I felt it settle inside my chest and hollow me from the inside out. Because when Selene spoke, she did it with a strange calm that made cruelty sound like commentary, as if she were describing the weather or the taste of her tea instead of dismantling the life we had built, telling me she felt trapped by repetition, restless with familiarity, and exhausted by the rhythm of days that once comforted her. And I stood there gripping the edge of the sofa, trying to translate the meaning behind her carefully chosen phrases, wondering whether she meant the routines, the apartment, the city, or me, until the realization struck with quiet brutality that it was all of it together, layered into a single declaration of dissatisfaction that she had rehearsed long before letting it fall into the room. And as I searched her face for some sign of hesitation or regret, I found only the practiced distance of someone who had already stepped away in her mind, while leaving her body behind to deliver the message, forcing me to confront the fact that this was not a sudden moment of honesty, but the conclusion of a silent argument she had been having without me for months. And in that stillness, as the shadows crept across the floor and the hum of the refrigerator echoed through the hallway, I realized that the words themselves were not the true wound, but the certainty that she had been preparing to leave long before I ever noticed the cracks forming beneath our carefully maintained surface. The following morning arrived with a brightness that felt almost mocking, sunlight spilling through the narrow kitchen window and illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air, as if nothing in the world had shifted, while I sat at the counter pretending to read headlines on my phone though every sentence blurred into noise. And Selene moved around me with a gentleness that felt rehearsed, placing a mug of coffee near my elbow and offering a small smile that carried none of the weight of the night before, speaking about errands and schedules as if our lives were still aligned along the same path. And I answered her politely, measuring every word, aware that she was studying my face for signs of anger or despair. But what she saw instead was quiet observation, because something inside me had changed, and I was no longer searching for reassurance but for clarity, noticing the way her gaze lingered on her phone when it vibrated, the way she angled the screen away from me, and how her laughter now arrived half a second too late, all subtle details that I had once dismissed as nothing more than stress or distraction. Yet now they assembled themselves into a pattern that refused to be ignored. And as I watched her pour sugar into her cup with unnecessary care, I felt the strange sensation of standing outside my own life, seeing it not as a shared narrative but as two separate stories unfolding in parallel, connected only by habit and the walls we still occupied together. Later that afternoon, seeking distraction, I met with an old friend at a quiet cafe tucked between a bookstore and a florist, a place that smelled of roasted beans and paperbacks, where conversation drifted easily among strangers who would never remember my name. And as we spoke about work and mundane frustrations, he hesitated before mentioning a rumor he had overheard months earlier, something vague and unconfirmed, about Selene attending events with someone else. Not openly but close enough to raise questions, and though he tried to soften the statement, I felt it lodge inside me like a splinter, igniting a slow burn of suspicion that refused to fade, because even without proof, the idea resonated with the subtle shifts I had been noticing at home. And as I left the cafe, the city seemed louder, every sound amplified by my racing thoughts, until I found myself replaying every recent interaction, every moment she had withdrawn or deflected, realizing how often I had chosen comfort over curiosity, preferring to believe that distance was temporary rather than confront the possibility that it had been intentional. That night, unable to sleep, I sat alone in my small home office, the only light coming from the glow of my computer screen, which cast long shadows across the shelves and framed photographs that now felt like artifacts from a different lifetime. And driven by a need for answers I could no longer suppress, I searched through forgotten backups and cached files until fragments of conversations emerged, words that confirmed what my intuition had already whispered, revealing a connection she had hidden. Messages filled with longing and secrecy that spoke of stolen moments and postponed decisions, and though I expected rage to erupt within me, what settled instead was a heavy calm, the kind that arrives when uncertainty finally dissolves, leaving behind the stark outline of truth. And as I read through the remnants of her digital confessions, I felt as though I were wandering through the ruins of a house I once called home, touching the charred beams of promises that had already burned away. Understanding now that the betrayal was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion that had been underway long before she found the courage to admit her boredom aloud. In the days that followed, I withdrew without explanation, relocating my belongings to the spare bedroom and reducing our interactions to polite exchanges that held no warmth. And Selene responded with confusion that soon turned to unease, attempting to bridge the distance with gestures that felt staged, cooking elaborate meals, lighting candles, and wearing outfits she knew I once admired. But her efforts only emphasized the emptiness between us. Because I no longer sought comfort from someone who had already given her heart elsewhere, and as I maintained my routines with mechanical precision, leaving early for work and returning late, she paced the apartment like someone searching for an anchor, realizing too late that the stability she had taken for granted was slipping through her fingers. And in that silence, I discovered a strange sense of empowerment, not from causing her pain, but from reclaiming the parts of myself I had neglected, redirecting my energy toward physical and emotional growth that made me feel alive again, independent of her approval or validation. My transformation was subtle at first, small changes that gradually reshaped my presence, from early mornings at the gym to the quiet confidence that came with setting boundaries I had never enforced before. And Selene noticed, watching me with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. As if she were trying to reconcile the version of me she remembered with the man now standing before her, no longer tethered to her moods or expectations. And when she attempted to reestablish our connection through nostalgia and shared memories, I listened without engaging, understanding that longing for what once was could not repair what had already been broken, because trust, once fractured, does not mend through sentiment alone. And as the days passed, the distance between us became a living entity, occupying the space where affection once thrived, reminding us both that the life we had built together existed now only as a memory. The tension reached its peak during a social gathering hosted by mutual acquaintances, where Selene tried to present a united front, clinging to my side and performing affection for an audience that sensed the discord beneath our smiles. And when she leaned in to kiss me, seeking reassurance through spectacle, I gently stepped back and spoke words that revealed the truth she had tried to conceal, exposing her duplicity in a voice calm enough to command silence. And the room froze in collective discomfort as the weight of her actions settled upon her, forcing her to confront the reality she had avoided, while I walked away with a clarity that felt both liberating and final, leaving behind not only the party, but the last remnants of a relationship that had already ended long before either of us acknowledged it. Afterward, the confrontation continued in the quiet of our driveway, where she attempted to defend herself with half-formed excuses and apologies that arrived too late to matter. And as I revealed the evidence of her betrayal, she faltered, realizing that the story she had crafted could no longer shield her from the consequences of her choices. And though she begged for reconciliation, promising change and regret, I recognized that love without honesty is merely an illusion. And I refused to accept a version of the future built on denial, choosing instead to pursue closure through legal means that would formalize what had already been decided within my heart. And as she stood there in the fading light, wrapped in the remnants of a life she had dismantled, I felt not anger, but an overwhelming sense of release. The final separation unfolded in a sterile courtroom where paperwork replaced emotion and signatures marked the end of a chapter that had defined me for years. And as I walked out into the crisp air, free from the weight of secrecy and compromise, I experienced a profound stillness, the kind that arrives when you finally let go of what no longer serves you. And in that moment, I understood that healing is not about erasing the past, but about reclaiming the future with intention, embracing the unknown with courage, and trusting that beyond loss lies the possibility of renewal, waiting patiently for those willing to step forward. Months later, surrounded by the warmth of new connections and the promise of beginnings yet to unfold, I found myself standing beneath an open sky, feeling a quiet gratitude for the lessons etched into my journey, because through heartbreak and clarity, I had rediscovered the strength to choose myself, recognizing that freedom is not found in escape, but in the courage to face truth and move forward, leaving behind what was and welcoming what could be. The days that followed felt strangely light, as if a storm had finally passed and left behind air that was easier to breathe, even though the ground was still damp with memories that refused to disappear overnight. And I began to notice small shifts in how I moved through the world, how strangers' smiles no longer felt like threats to something fragile, how silence became a companion instead of a warning sign. Because for the first time in years, I was not waiting for someone else's mood to define the temperature of my day. And as I filled my evenings with long walks through unfamiliar streets, listening to the rhythm of passing traffic and the quiet conversations drifting from open windows, I realized how much of myself I had shelved to keep peace in a house that no longer wanted me, understanding now that compromise had slowly turned into erasure. And in reclaiming my space, even the simplest routines, making tea, organizing my desk, choosing music, felt like acts of quiet defiance against the life I had outgrown, reminding me that independence is not loud or dramatic, but steady and deeply personal. There were moments, of course, when the past tried to reach for me, when old songs or familiar scents stirred memories that lingered like ghosts at the edge of my awareness, and I would pause, allowing the ache to surface without letting it pull me backward, recognizing that grief is not a sign of weakness but proof that something once mattered. And instead of resisting it, I learned to sit with the discomfort, to observe it as it passed through me like a tide that rises and falls, leaving behind a clearer shoreline. And in those moments, I felt a deeper compassion for the version of myself who had tried so hard to hold everything together, realizing that his effort, though ultimately unsuccessful, had been sincere, and that sincerity deserved respect rather than regret. As weeks turned into months, I began forming connections that felt effortless, conversations that flowed without the undercurrent of tension I had grown accustomed to. And in the laughter shared with new friends, I sensed a freedom that did not require explanation, a mutual understanding that life is too brief to be lived in constant defense of someone else's indecision. And with each encounter, I rebuilt my sense of identity, discovering interests I had neglected and ambitions I had postponed, finding joy in exploration rather than stability alone. And this gradual transformation taught me that growth does not demand dramatic gestures, only consistent steps forward, even when the path ahead feels uncertain. One evening, as I watched the city lights reflect off the river, their shimmer broken into countless fragments by the gentle movement of water, I felt a surge of gratitude for the lessons hidden within heartbreak, understanding that pain often arrives not to destroy us, but to redirect us toward a truer version of ourselves. And in that quiet reflection, I acknowledged that the end of one story is simply the beginning of another, shaped by the choices we make when no one is watching. And it was there, beneath the hum of passing cars and distant music, that I decided to live with greater intention, to honor the resilience that carried me through loss, and to trust that the unknown holds possibilities far greater than anything I had left behind. When I eventually crossed paths with Selene again, it was in a public place where neither of us had expected to see the other, and the moment felt surreal, like encountering a character from a novel I had already finished reading. And though there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, it was quickly replaced by a reserved politeness that mirrored my own. And as we exchanged brief pleasantries, I sensed that she, too, had been changed by what had transpired, though perhaps in ways she did not yet fully understand. And as we parted without lingering, I felt no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that our paths had diverged for reasons neither of us could ignore, and that the space between us was now a testament to growth rather than loss. In the solitude that followed, I continued cultivating a life rooted in authenticity, choosing environments and relationships that nourished rather than drained me. And in doing so, I discovered that fulfillment is not found in perfection, but in alignment, in the courage to remain true to oneself even when it requires difficult decisions. And as I reflected on the journey that led me here, I realized that the most profound changes often begin with a single moment of clarity, one that challenges us to release what no longer serves and embrace the freedom that comes with self-respect. And it was this understanding that guided me forward, shaping each choice with a renewed sense of purpose. There were days when the world felt expansive, filled with opportunity and promise, and others when it felt heavy with uncertainty. Yet through it all, I remained grounded in the knowledge that I had survived something that once felt insurmountable, and this resilience became a quiet source of strength, reminding me that even in the face of profound change, we possess the capacity to adapt, to learn, and to emerge wiser. And as I shared my experiences with those who listened, I found that vulnerability forged connections far deeper than pretense ever could, reinforcing the idea that honesty is the foundation upon which meaningful relationships are built. Over time, I learned to appreciate the beauty of impermanence, recognizing that every chapter, no matter how painful or joyous, contributes to the mosaic of our lives. And as I stood on the threshold of new beginnings, I carried with me the lessons of the past without allowing them to define my future, embracing the notion that change, though often uncomfortable, is the catalyst for growth, and that by releasing what we cling to out of fear, we make room for experiences that align with our true selves. And in this acceptance, I found a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. As seasons shifted and the world continued its endless cycle of renewal, I found solace in the rhythm of everyday moments, in the laughter of strangers, the warmth of sunlight on my skin, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived on my own terms. And with each passing day, I felt more connected to the present, less haunted by what had been, and more open to what could be, understanding that the greatest gift we can offer ourselves is the freedom to evolve, to seek joy without guilt, and to trust that, even after the deepest heartbreak, there is always a path forward waiting to be discovered. In the end, I came to see my journey not as a story of loss, but as one of transformation, a testament to the power of self-awareness and the courage to choose change. And as I continued moving forward, guided by the lessons etched into my heart, I knew that no matter where life led me next, I would face it with openness, resilience, and a renewed sense of purpose, embracing each new chapter as an opportunity to grow, to heal, and to become the person I was always meant to be.